We're going to be in Leviticus chapter 20 today. I was emailed and I was asked a question, just kind of a generic question. I was asked, what is the hardest or most difficult subject that you have been asked to speak on or preach over? As I thought about that, it's kind of hard to answer because I've taught on many things that I believe to be hard issues. Subjects such as homosexuality, or maybe that of abortion, that of adultery, or cohabitation, modesty. And you begin going through all those lists of different issues, and I believe that they're all difficult to preach upon. And I don't know that I can pick one and say this is the hardest one for sure, but one that gave me a little bit more trouble in my sermon preparation than others was a preacher's retreat I was asked to speak at a couple of years ago. And the theme for the preacher's retreat was Leviticus in the 21st century. Now, as I began to think about that, Leviticus in the 21st century, that's kind of hard to put into words. For those of you that are familiar with the book of Leviticus, you know that there's a lot of good principles in there that still apply to us today, but it's also kind of a difficult book to read. Well, Leviticus chapter 20 was a chapter that I was assigned for this particular retreat. And as I was going through and studying out this chapter, studying out this book, it became evident to me that our cultures today are so drastically different than they were back then. For example, one of the issues, the major issues being dealt with by God in the 20th chapter of the book of Leviticus, was that there was this false god by the name of Molech. Molech was a statue that was built by men, and in the middle of his belly, in the middle of his stomach, there was this big hole. And inside that hole they would light a fire. And they would come to that false god and they would put their offerings, their sacrifices into that belly, into that fire, and that would become their sacrifice to that god. But their sacrifices weren't just any old sacrifices. We come to find out in this chapter that moms and dads were sacrificing their own children. They were bringing their children to this statue that was made by man, and there was this fire burning bright in the middle of its belly, and they would take their children and put their children in that fire and offer their sacrifice. You know, as I began to think about that, it gave me a reason to pause. As I think about all of the moms and dads that I don't know a single one, even on their worst day, that would take their child and place them in a physical fire, such as the belly of Molech. But I did begin to think about, while we may not be doing that by any stretch of the imagination, I believe, spiritually speaking, many times we are offering our children up to the false gods of this world, where we're offering them up to the false gods of this world. Maybe we're offering our children up to the god of sports. Maybe we're offering our children up to the god of financial gain. Maybe we're offering our children up to the god of selfishness. Maybe we're offering our children up to any god but the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible that requires complete and total dedication and commitment to our Savior, Jesus Christ. One particular passage that stood out from this chapter, Leviticus chapter 20, starting in verse 4, we read these words, "And if the people of the land do at all close their eyes to that man when he gives one of his children to Molech, and do not put him to death, then I will set my face against that man and against his clan, and will cut them off from among their people, him and all who follow him in whoring after Molech." We see that God comes down pretty hard on those who worship this false god, but I think it's important for us to pay attention to the fact that God didn't just stop there. God didn't just stop by saying, all of you that are offering your children to Molech, don't do that anymore. That wasn't where God stopped. God turned his focus to the people who were not offering their children to Molech, but the people who knew that other people were doing it. Does that make sense? The bystanders, you might say. You see, many times I've heard the reasons, I've heard the excuses, I've heard the ideology that's out there where we begin to think, we may not verbalize it, but we begin to think I'm not doing all of the bad things that are out there in this world. I'm not doing all of the bad things that we see on television, that we hear on the radio, that we read in the newspaper. I'm not doing those things, so I'm okay. God's standards are a little different than ours. You see, we find here as God was talking to these people in Leviticus chapter 20. He says, if you know of someone who's doing this with their children, but you close your eyes, you look away, you ignore it, you pretend like it's not happening, he said, you will be cut off from your people. You see, God didn't just stop with the people who were actually doing the deed. He continued on by making it clear that there's more to being a child of God than abstaining from doing bad things. You see, it's also our job to stand up for the truth and to speak up for the truth when we see truth being ignored. So my question for you, my challenge for you as we think about this great passage is not asking yourself the question, are you giving your children up to Molech? I don't believe that you are. The question that we need to be asking is, am I standing up for the truth? Because God will hold me accountable as to whether or not I stood for the truth. You see, it doesn't matter if I personally in my own life, if I choose to live a moral life and I choose to ignore a lot of the cultural pressures that are out there today, that's not enough. I also have to stand up. I have to stand up for the truth, and I have to speak out for Jesus when I'm surrounded by a world of people who's trying to destroy him. Until next time, thank you for watching.